I was standing in line at a grocery store when the cashier handed me a dollar lottery ticket instead of change. 3 weeks later, I found myself sitting cross-legged on my kitchen floor at 2 in the morning, staring at a number on my phone that would change absolutely everything and put a target on my back that I never saw coming. Welcome to Kate's Fortune Stories. It's Kate again, and I'm so happy you're here with me. Before we begin, please subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. And tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I always love seeing how far these stories travel. Don't forget to subscribe, because this story is only just beginning. For most of my adult life, I thought the hardest part of being broke wasn't the shame of it, or even the exhaustion. It was the arithmetic, the endless, grinding math of a life stretched a little too thin. $41 for groceries, $68 for Mia's cleats, $112 left until payday, and could I make it stretch? I could always make it stretch. That was the thing about me. I always found a way, even when finding a way cost me something I couldn't quite name. My name is Rachel Coleman. I was 42 years old, front desk coordinator at a physical therapy clinic on Fairview Avenue in Boise, Idaho, mother of one, ex-wife of one. My life was not the kind that made for interesting conversation at parties. It was a rented townhouse with beige carpet that never quite came clean, a 10-year-old Subaru with a check engine light I'd learned to ignore, and a daughter named Mia, 15 years old, sharper than anyone gave her credit for. My mornings started at 5:40, coffee from a machine I'd bought secondhand for $4, a 30-minute drive to the clinic, where I smiled at patients recovering from knee surgeries and rotator cuff tears for 8 hours straight, then home to make dinner, check Mia's homework, and fall into bed by 10:30, already dreading the next 5:40 alarm. On the weekends I did laundry, paid what bills I could, and told myself this was simply what life looked like now. It hadn't felt true in a long time. Not since Derek. Derek Coleman, my ex-husband, was tall and easy to like in the way that men who've never had to try very hard often are. We were married for 12 years when he told me, with the mild inconvenience of a man announcing a scheduling conflict, that he was moving in with Ashley Ford, the paralegal at the insurance defense firm where he worked. She was 11 years younger than me, with a way of tilting her head when she listened that I should have recognized, the one time I met her, as something closer to calculation than curiosity. The divorce was not kind. Derek's attorney happened to be a close friend of Ashley's, and somehow, despite 12 years of marriage, despite the fact that I had covered our expenses through 2 of his failed side businesses, I walked away with a townhouse lease, half of very little, and full custody of Mia, who looked at her father during the proceedings with a calm, unreadable expression of someone who had already decided not to expect much from him. Derek paid child support when it was convenient for him, which was roughly 6 months out of 12. When I called to ask about a missed payment, it was often Ashley who answered his phone, telling me in a voice trained for reasonableness that Derek was going through a rough patch and that I should try to be understanding. I was not particularly interested in being understanding. I filed with the state enforcement office twice. It helped for a while, then stopped helping, the way these things do. And still, somehow I kept going. That had become the whole of my identity by then. Not thriving, not even hopeful, just upright. Still standing most days. The first sign that something had shifted came on an ordinary Tuesday in late September. Mia mentioned, almost as an aside while unloading the dishwasher, that her dad had texted her asking whether I'd said anything unusual lately, whether anything had changed at home. She laughed about it. "He's being so weird, Mom." I didn't laugh. Derek never asked questions without an angle behind them. Derek, in 12 years, had rarely asked about me at all unless there was something in it for him. I filed the comment away and didn't think much more about it, not yet. The second sign came a few days later. Ashley liked a photo of mine on Instagram, one I'd posted over a year earlier of Mia and me at the county fair. Ashley had never once interacted with anything I'd posted, not in 3 years. I stared at the notification for a long moment before I blocked her and told myself it meant nothing. The third sign I didn't recognize as a sign at all when it happened. It was a Thursday evening in the first week of October. I was at the Fred Meyer off Fairview, buying pasta, a rotisserie chicken marked down because it was close to its date, the same handful of groceries I always bought when the account was running thin toward the end of the month. The line was long. The cashier, a young woman named Jasmine, according to the tag pinned crookedly to her vest, rang up my total, $31.40. I handed her 2 20s. She frowned into her open register drawer. "I'm out of ones," she said. "Would a scratch ticket be okay instead? I've got a stack of them back here I'm supposed to use for exactly this." She held one up, a golden red Idaho lottery ticket, the kind that cost $1 and sat forgotten in the bottom of 100 purses across the state. I almost said no. I nearly asked her to just round down, keep the dollar, forget it. But the line behind me had grown. Jasmine was already holding the ticket out with an apologetic little smile, and I was tired in the specific way that makes a person stop fighting small battles. I took it, dropped it into my bag without really looking at it, and drove home thinking about nothing but whether the chicken would stretch across 2 dinners. That night, after Mia had gone to bed, I found the ticket at the bottom of my purse while digging for a hair tie. I nearly threw it in the recycling. Instead, for reasons I still can't fully explain, I opened the lottery app on my phone and scanned the barcode printed along the bottom edge. The screen froze for a second, reloaded, and then displayed a number that made the room tilt slightly around me. I sat down right there on the kitchen floor because my legs had simply stopped cooperating. $84 million. My $1 ticket, the one I had nearly refused to take. I checked the numbers again, one by one, my finger trembling against the glass. I checked the date. I checked the numbers a third time. Every single digit matched. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just sat there with my back against the cabinet, holding a scrap of gold cardstock worth $84 million, and thought, what happens now? I had no idea yet that winning wasn't going to be the dangerous part. What came after would be. I don't know how long I stayed on that floor. The towel was cold through my leggings. Down the hall, I could hear the faint blue glow of Mia's phone under her door, some show she watched before falling asleep. I pressed my spine harder against the cabinet and made myself breathe slowly. Don't tell anyone. That was the first full thought that arrived, clear and strangely calm. Not I'm rich, not thank God, not my life is different now, just that one flat instruction rising up from somewhere underneath my racing pulse. Not yet. Not until you understand what you're dealing with. I don't know exactly where that instinct came from. Maybe it was 12 years of marriage to a man who had always known how to turn information into leverage. Maybe it was 3 years of fighting an enforcement office that taught me the world doesn't hand you what you're owed. You have to be strategic, quiet, and several steps ahead of the people who might try to take it from you. Whatever the source, I listened to it. I got up off the floor. I tucked the ticket into the zipped inner pocket of my winter coat, hanging on its hook by the door, the coat nobody else ever touched, and I went to bed, though sleep never actually came. By 1 a.m, I was back at the kitchen table with my laptop open, my phone face down beside me, the house dark except for the glow of the screen. I didn't search for how to spend the money. I searched for how to protect it. I read for almost 4 hours straight. I read about a man in Michigan who won $19 million and was broke again within 6 years, worn down by lawsuits from people he barely knew. I read about a woman whose extended family had descended on her like a slow-moving storm the week her win became public. I read, 3 separate times, about a case out of Indiana where a woman's ex-husband successfully argued that her lottery winnings counted as a marital asset because she bought the ticket using a debit card linked to an account that had, technically, once been joint, years earlier, before the divorce was even finalized. A joint account. I didn't have one with Derek anymore. The divorce had settled that cleanly. But Mia connected us in a way no court order could fully sever. Derek's child support obligation, meant there was still an active family court case with our names on it. And an active case, according to one forum post I read 3 times, written by someone claiming to be a family law paralegal in Idaho, might mean Derek retained some technical standing to petition the court on financial matters that touched Mia's welfare. Was that actually true? I had no way of knowing. I was a front desk coordinator, not a lawyer. But I felt the shape of the danger anyway, cold and specific. Derek was already asking Mia questions. Derek, who had never once missed an opportunity in his life. Derek, who was now living with a paralegal who would know exactly how to use a courtroom as a lever. I sat very still and made a list, the way I always made lists, pen pressed hard into a spiral notebook I kept in the kitchen drawer. What could I lose? The money itself, if Derek found any legal foothold at all. My job, if I mishandled the transition and word got out too soon. My apartment, if I suddenly changed how I lived before the claim was even settled. Mia's stability, if this turned into a drawn-out legal fight that pulled her into the middle of it. My own safety, if the wrong people found out too early. I stared at the 5 items, then added a 6th. My judgment, if I let myself panic. I underlined that 1 twice. Here is what I decided, alone in my kitchen at 4:30 in the morning. I would not claim the ticket right away. Idaho gave winners 180 days to come forward. I didn't need all of that time, but I needed several weeks, enough to build a structure around myself before I ever walked through the Lottery Commission's front door. The plan, in outline, was simple. First, find an attorney, not a general practice attorney, but someone who specifically handled lottery and windfall protection. I'd read that such lawyers existed, and that many offered a free first consultation. I would find one somewhere other than Boise proper, somewhere Derek had no reason to look, and I would call from a number he didn't recognize. Second, I would tell absolutely no one. Not my mother, not my coworker Denise, who I trusted with almost everything except a secret this size. Not Mia, not yet. Third, I would change nothing visible about my life. Same job, same townhouse, same tired Subaru, until the legal groundwork was solid beneath me. And Derek, what to do about Derek I didn't know yet. But I was already starting to think about it, even then. I closed the laptop at 5:15. I had to be at the clinic by 7:30. I splashed cold water on my face and studied the woman in the bathroom mirror for a long moment, pale, hollow under the eyes, her mouth set in a line that had probably been there for years without my noticing. She looked like someone who had been waiting for something to change without quite believing it would. Something had changed. "Pull it together, Rachel," I told her quietly. "You've got work to do." I called the clinic Monday morning and said I had a dentist emergency. Denise, who covered the front desk when I was out, asked with genuine concern whether I was okay, and I told her it was just a cracked filling, nothing serious. She accepted this with the satisfaction of someone who'd received a tidy explanation, and I hung up and drove west out of Boise toward Nampa, where I'd found the man I was looking for the night before. Walter Greaves, attorney at law, specialized in lottery and sudden wealth asset protection. His office sat on the second floor of a converted brick building downtown, and his website was almost aggressively plain. No flashy testimonials, no stock photography of champagne glasses, just a Navy header, a short list of credentials, and a phone number. He'd been quoted twice in the Idaho Statesman on unclaimed prize law. That was enough for me. I'd called from Mia's old tablet using a Google Voice number and booked a 10 o'clock appointment under the name R. Coleman. The drive took 40 minutes. I kept the radio off the entire way, rehearsing what I'd say, checking my mirrors more than the traffic really required. Walter Greaves turned out to be somewhere in his 60s, silver-bearded, reading glasses pushed up into thinning hair, and he shook my hand with the brisk efficiency of a man who had stopped being surprised by anything a client told him a long time ago. I sat across from his desk, purse in my lap, and told him everything. The ticket, the amount, the ex-husband, the paralegal girlfriend, the questions already being funneled through my daughter. He listened without interrupting once. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "How long ago did you find out?" "4 days." "And you haven't told a single person?" "No one." He nodded slowly, as though confirming something he'd already suspected. "Good. That was exactly the right instinct." He leaned forward, elbows on the desk. "Mrs. Coleman, I want to be straightforward with you. Legally, you're in a strong position. Idaho is not a community property state, so your ex-husband has no automatic claim to a prize you won well after your divorce was finalized." He held up one finger. "That said, there are scenarios where he could still attempt to establish standing, particularly if he can argue the ticket was purchased with funds that were, at any point, tied to an unresolved financial dispute between you two." "There's no dispute," I said. "Everything from the divorce was settled years ago." "Then your exposure is limited." He paused. "Limited is not the same as zero. If he hires the right attorney, and they get creative, they can file motions. They can tie up disbursement. They can make this expensive and slow, even while being entirely wrong on the law." He studied me for a moment. "Do you understand what I'm telling you?" I did. He was telling me that being right and being safe were two very different things, and that the gap between them was exactly where a man like Derek would try to live for as long as I let him. "So what do I actually do?" I asked. "Besides hire you?" "You wait," he said. "Let the paperwork move at its own pace, even when instinct wants to rush it. Patience is a strategy here. It's not glamorous, but it works." We spent nearly 2 hours in that office. By the time I left, I had officially retained Walter Greaves, paying his retainer out of a modest savings account Derek had never known existed, one I'd quietly built at $50 a month since the divorce, almost as an act of stubbornness more than strategy. I had a plan now. Greaves would draft a blind trust through which the winnings could be claimed, so that my name wouldn't appear in any initial public filing. Idaho law permitted claims to be made through a trust, which meant that with the right preparation, I could remain anonymous. The formal claim would happen in roughly 3 weeks, once the trust paperwork was airtight. I drove home that afternoon feeling something I hadn't felt in years. Not happiness, exactly. Something steadier and more useful than that. Control. The call came that same evening, while I was browning ground beef for tacos. A no number. I'd been letting unfamiliar calls go to voicemail since the divorce, but something made me pick up. "Rachel!" Derek's voice, smooth, deliberately casual. "Got a second?" "What do you need, Derek?" "Nothing big. Just—" I heard through the grapevine there was a big Powerball win somewhere around Boise. Fairview area, I think. A pause, timed just a beat too precisely to be accidental. "Funny, that's practically your neighborhood." My hand tightened around the phone. I said nothing. "You there?" "I'm here," I said, my voice flat. "I don't even play the lottery, Derek. Is there something you actually called about?" "Mia's doing fine, by the way, since you didn't ask." Another pause. "Look, I just think if anything ever changed for you financially, it'd be worth a conversation. For Mia's sake. Making sure she's taken care of. For Mia's sake." There it was, the maneuver I recognized instantly. My own daughter turned into leverage before he'd even confirmed there was anything to leverage. "I'll let Mia know you called," I said and hung up. I stood at the stove for a full minute, phone pressed flat against my chest, listening to my own pulse. Then I picked it back up, opened my email, and wrote Walter Greaves a message with the subject line. He already knows. I detailed the call exactly as it had happened, word for word, while it was still fresh. Greaves replied within 15 minutes. "This is useful. It establishes a pattern early. Save everything from here forward." That was the moment I understood this wasn't just going to be a financial transaction. It was going to be a fight, and I had the strange, clarifying sensation of someone who has just glimpsed the other side's hand before the cards are fully dealt. I wasn't frightened anymore. I was ready. The trust documents were finalized on a Wednesday, 18 days after I'd sat cross-legged on my kitchen floor watching the world tilt sideways. Greaves had named it the RC Family Trust. Unremarkable, uninformative, exactly the way I wanted it. I signed everything in his office, my hand steady, my signature the same controlled cursive I'd been using since middle school. His paralegal, a calm, unflappable woman named Priya, notarized the papers and filed them with the county clerk that same afternoon. Then Greaves and I drove together to the Idaho Lottery office in Boise. The claims process was nowhere near as cinematic as I'd imagined it during those sleepless early nights. There was a waiting room with mismatched chairs and a water cooler that hummed too loudly. There was a form. There were 2 officials who examined the ticket under ultraviolet light, ran it through a scanner 3 separate times, and asked me to confirm my social security number twice. There was a long wait after that. Then one of them returned, sat across from me, and said, with the rehearsed neutrality of someone who delivers this exact news for a living, "Miss Coleman, on behalf of the Idaho Lottery Commission, congratulations. The prize is confirmed at $84 million. Greaves had already arranged for the lump sum payout. After federal and state taxes, the actual disbursement would come to just under $48 million, transferred into the trust in stages, the first installment arriving within 10 to 14 business days." I shook the official's hand, thanked Greaves, and drove home to my townhouse in my old Subaru, where I made Mia her favorite dinner, baked mac and cheese with the crispy top she liked, and told her absolutely nothing, because the walls around us weren't finished yet. I told myself I needed 3 more days. I got 2. On Friday, Greaves called me at the clinic. I stepped into the supply closet to take it. He filed, Greaves said, a petition, this morning, in Ada County Family Court. Derek Coleman, represented by an attorney named Todd Marsh, claiming standing to contest distribution of lottery winnings held under the RC Family Trust, on the theory that the ticket may have been purchased using funds tied to unresolved support obligations. A short, dry pause. It's thin. It's very thin. But it's a filing, which means it's public record, which means he knows. He found out about the trust? He found the filing. Trusts get registered, publicly, once they're active in a claim. Someone was watching for exactly that. Probably Ashley. She'd note a check. I closed my eyes, standing among the boxes of paper towels and hand sanitizer. What do? We respond. I'll file a motion to dismiss Monday morning. His standing argument doesn't hold up under Idaho precedent. But I want to warn you, he may try to apply pressure outside the courtroom first. He was right. That evening, Derek showed up at my front door. I hadn't buzzed him in. Someone in the building must have held the entrance for him, a security gap I'd never once considered a problem until that exact moment. He stood in the hallway with Ashley half a step behind him, and he wore the expression I recognized from every argument we'd ever had, the wounded reasonableness of a man who had already cast himself as the injured party. "Rachel," he said, spreading his hands, "we just need to talk." "You filed a petition against me in family court," I said. "I don't think this is a conversation. I think it's a tactic." Ashley stepped forward slightly, her expression arranged into practiced warmth. "We're not here to fight, Rachel. We're here because we care about what happens to Mia." "Stop," I said quietly, and something in my tone made her actually stop. "Mia's future has been my responsibility for 3 years, while her father paid child support 4 months out of 12. You don't get to use my daughter's name as a legal strategy." I looked at Derek. "Your lawyer can talk to my lawyer. That's the only conversation happening tonight." I shut the door. I stood with my back against it, listening to them linger in the hallway, Ashley's voice low and urgent, Derek's muted response, until finally the elevator chimed and they were gone. My hands were shaking, but it was the shake of something survived, not something feared. I photographed the empty hallway with the timestamp visible, in case it mattered later, then called Greaves and told him everything. That night I texted my mother and asked if Mia and I could stay with her in Twin Falls for a few days. She replied within seconds. Of course. Are you okay? I thought about it honestly before answering. I will be, I typed back. I just need a little space. I pulled Mia out of school for the Friday, and we drove out that evening. My mother made her famous pot roast, asked no questions I clearly wasn't ready to answer, and let me sleep 9 straight hours in my childhood bedroom for the first time in months. For 3 days, I barely checked my email. Mia and I took long walks along the river. I let my mother's ancient beagle sleep across my feet every night. It was the most peace I'd felt in 3 years. On the drive back to Boise, Mia looked over from the passenger seat. Mom, what's actually going on? I glanced at her, 15 years old, with her father's sharp instincts but none of his self-interest, a combination that had always both worried and comforted me in equal measure. Something good, I said. I just need to make sure it's safe first. She studied me for a long moment, then turned back toward the window. Okay, she said, in the tone that meant she was waiting, not accepting. I can live with that. The walls were nearly finished. It was time to build something else on top of them. The settlement offer arrived by email the following Tuesday, formal and polished, routed through Todd Marsh's firm, which told me Derek and Ashley had shifted from improvisation to something closer to strategy. The subject line read, Proposal for amicable resolution, Coleman matter. I read it once at the kitchen counter, coffee going cold beside me, and forwarded it straight to Greaves without responding. The substance was elegantly ugly. Derek would withdraw his petition if I agreed to a voluntary contribution of 7% of the after-tax winnings into a fund jointly managed for Mia's long-term benefit, college, housing, whatever came next. 7% of just under $48 million came to roughly $3.3 million, handed to a man through a structure he would have partial control over, in exchange for stopping something a judge was almost certainly going to make him stop doing anyway. Did he actually believe I would fold at the sight of a number with commas in it? That the woman who had survived his leaving, his sporadic support payments, his years of quiet financial cruelty, would suddenly lose her nerve over legal letterhead? I called Greaves. Tell me you're not considering this, he said before I could get a word out. I'm not considering it, I said. I'm furious. Good. Furious is useful. Here's what matters. This offer went through formal counsel, which means they believe there was a real chance you'd accept it. That tells me his underlying case is weaker than they're projecting. A confident plaintiff doesn't offer 7%. He waits and lets a judge decide. So he's bluffing. He's leveraging uncertainty, which is a slightly different thing. He's betting you don't fully understand how thin his position is. Do you want me to decline in writing? Yes. Make it clear. Greaves's response was 3 tight, bloodless paragraphs. The R.C. Family Trust declines the proposed resolution. The trust maintains that Mr. Coleman possesses no cognizable legal interest in the subject prize. The trust looks forward to addressing the pending petition before the court. It was, in its own dry way, satisfying to read. After that, things went quiet in a way that felt deliberate rather than reassuring. Derek stopped calling. Ashley's number, which had shown up twice on my caller ID as unknown before I traced it, went silent. The petition sat pending, with Greaves's motion to dismiss scheduled to be heard in 3 weeks. But the silence had weight to it. I could feel it the way you feel someone standing behind you before you turn around, a pressure change in the room. Let them watch, I thought. I had things to do. I still hadn't told Mia the whole truth, and I hadn't told my mother either. But I was tired of carrying the entire weight alone, and Greaves had gently pointed out more than once that isolation under sustained pressure tends to produce worse decisions, not better ones. I thought about who I actually trusted with something this size. Not Denise, kind, but incapable of holding a secret past lunchtime. Not my mother, not yet. She'd worry in ways I couldn't manage on top of everything else. I thought of Renee Ortiz. Renee was in her 50s, a retired family counselor who now ran a weekly support circle for women rebuilding after divorce, out of a community room at the Boise YWCA. I'd attended maybe 4 sessions a year after Derek left, then stopped once I felt like I'd moved past the acute part of it and needed the Saturday hours for extra shifts instead. Renee had called to check in on me once, years ago, and I'd meant to call her back for longer than I wanted to admit. I called her on a Wednesday afternoon from the clinic parking lot. She picked up on the 3rd ring. "Rachel Coleman," she said, with the warm recognition of someone who remembers more than she lets on. "How are you?" "I'm in a situation," I said. "A complicated one. I need someone who knows how to hold information without trying to fix it for me." A brief silence. "Come by the center Thursday evening. We'll talk privately. Bring coffee. The stuff here is terrible." I actually smiled, for the first time in what felt like weeks. We sat in her small office for almost 2 hours on Thursday. I told her most of it. Not the exact figure. Not yet, but enough. The win, the petition, the isolation I'd been quietly managing on my own. Renee listened the way she'd clearly been trained to, without visible reaction, without offering advice until I asked for it directly. "What do you need most right now?" she finally asked. "I need to know I'm not overreacting," I said. "That protecting myself this aggressively isn't paranoid." She looked at me steadily. "A man showed up at your apartment with his girlfriend to pressure you, days after filing a legal action against you, the same week you'd come into a life-changing amount of money." She let that sit. "What exactly would an appropriate response look like, in your opinion?" I exhaled slowly. "Thank you. I'll be honest with you," she said. "What you're describing isn't really a legal problem or a financial problem underneath it all. It's a pattern problem. You've been managing this man's pattern for years. This is just the same pattern with much higher stakes." She leaned forward. "The question was never whether you're strong enough to handle it. You've already shown that repeatedly. The real question is whether you'll let yourself accept help while you do it." I thought about that the entire drive home. Accepting help, not as weakness, but as infrastructure. Not dependence, but architecture. The way a wall needs other walls before it becomes a room, instead of just a line drawn in the dirt. I had Greaves. Now I had Renee. I had Mia, who understood more than anyone gave her credit for. I was building something real. Let the other side keep watching. They had no idea how many walls I'd already put up. The invitation came from Derek's mother. Margaret Coleman was 71, precise and soft-spoken, the kind of woman who wore matching cardigan sets and maintained an almost heroic faith in her son despite a great deal of evidence to the contrary. We had always gotten along, more than gotten along, really. In the early years of my marriage, she taught me her stuffing recipe, and she'd been in the waiting room the day Mia was born. After the divorce, she'd sent me a short handwritten note apologizing for how things had turned out, which I still had tucked in a drawer, because it was the most honest thing anyone in Derek's family had said to me in over a decade. When Margaret called and asked if I'd come to Sunday dinner, just family, just to clear the air, I hesitated for a long moment. Then I thought about what Renee had said about patterns, and I said yes. I didn't bring Mia. Margaret's house in Meridian smelled the way it always had, roasted chicken and something warm from a candle burning somewhere. Derek was already in the living room when I arrived, standing with his hands in his pockets, his posture a little too deliberate, like a man who'd been coached. Ashley sat in the armchair that had belonged to Derek's late father, a detail I couldn't decide was careless or entirely intentional. Margaret moved between kitchen and dining room with the brittle, determined energy of someone trying to force an evening into feeling ordinary through sheer effort alone. We sat down to eat. For the first 20 minutes, nothing happened. We talked about Margaret's garden, about Mia's grades, about the weather turning colder early this year. Derek passed the rolls. Ashley smiled at the appropriate intervals. It was a performance, and not a bad one. Then Derek set down his fork and looked at me with the expression he'd spent 12 years perfecting. Gentle, reasonable, deeply concerned. "Rachel, I want you to know the petition was a panic decision. Honestly, Ashley thought we needed to protect ourselves legally, and I let that push me into it faster than I should have. I'm not proud of it. He paused for effect. You've worked so hard your whole life. You deserve this. I mean that. I kept eating. Is Todd Marsh still on retainer? A small flicker crossed his face. It's more of a formality at this point. Paperwork. So the petition is still active. Ashley spoke up, her voice pitched at careful warmth. Rachel, we all just want what's best for Mia. Nobody is trying to take anything away from you. But she's a teenager now, and the decisions you make in the next few months are going to shape a lot of her future. Doesn't it make sense for all of us, as her parents, as people who care about her, to be part of that conversation? There it was, not the money directly. Mia, again, as the point of entry. Mia's future as the reason I should voluntarily build a structure that included the two of them. I set down my fork. I looked at Ashley first, then Derek. I think I've said this once already. I've built Mia's future for 3 years, alone, on a front desk salary, while managing support payments that showed up whenever it was convenient for you. I don't need help with Mia's future. That's the one thing I've never needed help with. I kept my voice level. I'd like you to withdraw the petition. Not because I'm afraid of losing, because continuing it is a waste of everyone's time and money when you have no standing to begin with. Do that, and we can go back to a normal co-parenting relationship the way it should have been for the last 3 years. If you don't, I looked at Derek directly. We'll see each other in court, and I'll win, and it will cost you significantly more than whatever you're hoping to gain. The silence afterward lasted maybe 4 seconds. Then Derek stood, not dramatically, but the tight control of the motion was its own kind of tell. You haven't changed, he said, then caught himself and started over. This is a mistake, Rachel. You're handling this the wrong way, and you're going to end up isolating yourself from people who actually care about you. I know exactly who cares about me, I said. Ashley rose too, resting a steadying hand on Derek's arm, and for one unguarded second, the warmth dropped entirely from her face, replaced by something calculating and clear. She had her own reasons for wanting access to that money. Whatever story she told Derek about protecting Mia, this was hers, specifically, in a way that had nothing to do with my daughter. That one look told me everything I needed to know. They left before dessert. Margaret stood in the kitchen doorway looking smaller than I'd ever seen her, hands clasped in front of her, wearing the particular grief of a woman who has watched her son be exactly this person before and keeps hoping it isn't who he really is. I'm sorry, Margaret, I said quietly, and I meant it. I know, she said. I'm sorry too. I drove home through the early dark, and I won't pretend I wasn't afraid. Not the raw panic of that first night on the kitchen floor, something lower, steadier. A cold understanding that Derek wasn't going to back down on his own, that Ashley was the sharper edge of the two of them, and that whatever came next would be worse than what had come before. But fear, when it's clean and specific, has a strange way of focusing a person instead of scattering them. I drove home and called Greaves and gave him every detail of the dinner, and by the time I hung up, I wasn't afraid anymore. I was decided. They had just shown me, completely and without ambiguity, that there would be no voluntary retreat, no goodwill, no version of this that ended with them simply stepping back. Good. I didn't need them to step back on their own. I needed them to walk into a courtroom. The hearing was set for a Thursday in November, Ada County Courthouse, downtown Boise. I wore a charcoal blazer I'd bought 8 years earlier for a job interview I barely remembered now. Somehow it had become my armor without my ever deciding it would be. I arrived 20 minutes early. Greaves was already in the hallway outside the courtroom, reviewing notes while Priya handed him documents with her usual unbothered efficiency. "How are you feeling?" he asked, glancing up. "Ready," I said, and it was the truest thing I'd said in weeks. Derek and Ashley arrived with Todd Marsh 7 minutes before the scheduled start. Marsh was mid-40s, sharply dressed, with the loose, confident manner of a man who'd won enough of these to develop a personal brand around it. Derek glanced at me once, briefly, then looked away. Ashley's gaze lingered longer, the same assessing look from Margaret's dining room, now with a formal edge to it, as though she were cataloging something for later use. Judge Patricia Hale presided, a former civil litigator in her 60s, known around the courthouse for her low tolerance for what she openly called family court theater. Marsh presented Derek's claim with practiced smoothness. His central argument was that the ongoing child support order created a continuing financial entanglement, giving Derek legitimate standing to request disclosure of my finances as they related to Mia's welfare. It wasn't a strong argument, but delivered with enough confidence, it could still burn through time and money before anyone shut it down. Judge Hale listened without expression, asked Marsh two precise, cutting questions, then turned to Greaves. He stood, and what he offered wasn't theatrical at all. It was precision so complete it felt almost inevitable, like watching a lock turn open. He began with Idaho case precedent establishing that post-divorce lottery winnings, purchased with separate funds, are unambiguously separate property under state law. He established that my personal savings account had existed solely in my name for years before the win, untouched by any marital order. He established that a child support obligation created no legal interest whatsoever in my separate assets. He dismantled the standing argument piece by piece. Then he said, "Your Honor, I'd also like to bring the court's attention to a documented pattern relevant to the motivation behind this petition." He introduced the evidence. Derek's call to me the evening the win first became a rumor, specifically referencing the store location where the ticket was sold. His and Ashley's unannounced visit to my apartment 2 days after the petition was filed. The formal settlement offer requesting a voluntary contribution in exchange for withdrawal. And then the piece I hadn't known he had until that morning. A message. Ashley had written to a friend shortly after the petition was filed, and it had reached Greaves's office anonymously. In it, she'd written that Derek didn't have a real legal claim, but that if they could keep the filing active long enough, Rachel would probably settle just to make it go away, that she wasn't the type to fight it out, and that worst case, they could tie things up for months and negotiate something decent, as long as they moved fast, before she had time to build any real defenses. The courtroom went very quiet. Ashley sat perfectly still. Marsh leaned toward Derek. A brief, urgent exchange passed between them. Judge Hale read the message twice, then looked directly at Ashley. "Miss Ford, you're here as an interested party, not as counsel of record. Is that correct?" "That's correct, Your Honor." "And you work as a paralegal professionally?" "I do." "Then you're aware that courts take a dim view of litigation filed with the documented intent of pressuring a settlement rather than pursuing a legitimate grievance." Marsh half rose. "Your Honor, that document was obtained." "Sit down, Mr. Marsh." Judge Hale didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "Miss Ford, I'll give you a chance to respond." Ashley tried. The message was personal, informal, taken out of context, she said. Her only intent had ever been to protect Mia. She spoke with a shade too much earnestness, the tone of someone used to talking her way through things. Judge Hale cut her off. "The message says what it says. The word settle appears twice, in a context that isn't ambiguous. Are you disputing that you wrote it?" A pause that ran half a second too long. "No, Your Honor, but the context you're offering doesn't match the plain language." She turned to Marsh. "I've reviewed the precedent, the standing argument, and this document, whose authenticity isn't in dispute. I'm giving you until Monday to file a voluntary withdrawal. If you don't, I'll rule on the motion to dismiss, and my written order, including my assessment of this petition's foundation and its likely motivation, will become public record." She looked at Derek directly. "Do you understand, Mr. Coleman?" Derek's face had gone the color of the courtroom carpet. "Yes, Your Honor." "Good. We're adjourned until Monday." I walked out into the cold November afternoon with Greaves beside me. Neither of us spoke for almost a full minute. "That went better than I expected," he finally said. "She forgot she wasn't the smartest person in that room," I said. He allowed himself a rare small smile. "I stood on the courthouse steps and thought about that message, 'She's not the type to fight,' and felt something quieter than triumph settle over me. The particular satisfaction of a lock finally, definitively opening. They had mistaken my survival for surrender. That mistake had been baked into this from the very beginning. I was the type to fight. I had simply chosen my moment with care. Monday morning at 9:52, Todd Marsh filed a voluntary withdrawal of the petition. Greaves texted me a single line, "It's done." I was at the clinic between appointments, and I read those 2 words standing very still in the hallway until a patient named Mr. Alvarez poked his head out of exam room to ask if I was all right. "Completely fine," I told him, and meant it. That afternoon, Greaves called with the fuller picture. Marsh had run the numbers over the weekend and reached the only sensible conclusion available to him. Letting the case go to a ruling would produce a written judicial opinion documenting the message, the pattern of pressure, and the collapse of a standing argument, a record that would follow Derek, who worked in commercial sales, for a long time. Ashley, as a working paralegal, faced an even more precarious situation. Idaho's rules of professional conduct had quite a bit to say about using legal process as a tool of financial coercion. She hadn't technically crossed into formal misconduct, but she'd come close enough that Marsh had apparently had a very frank conversation with her about the risk. "Should I pursue a bar complaint?" I asked. "My recommendation is you don't," Greaves said. "You've already won the actual matter. A complaint would cost you far more time and energy than it would cost her, and you've got better things ahead of you." I thought about Ashley in that courtroom, that half-second pause before she tried to explain away her own words. "You're right," I said. "Let it go." I wasn't forgiving her. I was simply done spending any part of myself on her. The first transfer landed on a Wednesday, $39,400,000, after every applicable tax, deposited into the RC Family Trust. I didn't drive to the bank. I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop, looking at the confirmation email, watching the light shift from gray morning to something warmer while I let the number become real in my mind, slowly on my own terms. Not in the reckless, catastrophic way I'd once feared it might arrive, but exactly the way I'd chosen, with walls and paperwork and a 60-something lawyer who didn't need anyone to be impressed by him. That evening I sat Mia down at the kitchen table, where she'd been doing algebra homework, and she looked up with the particular alertness of a teenager who can feel when a conversation is about to be different from the usual ones. I told her everything: the ticket, the floor, the weeks of carrying it by myself, the lawyer, the trust, the petition, the dinner at her grandmother's, the courtroom, the message, the withdrawal, the number, all of it. She listened without a word. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "You did all of that alone. I had help eventually, but at the start, yes, I figured it out by myself, sitting on the kitchen floor." She looked at me the way she rarely did, careful and assessing. "He texted me again a couple weeks ago. Asked if you'd been acting different." "I know." I told him, "You seem the same as always." A pause. I didn't know what was actually happening, but I knew enough not to tell him anything. I looked at my daughter, 15 years old, sitting at a kitchen table in a townhouse that had never quite felt like enough, and felt something open all the way through my chest. She had protected me without even understanding why it mattered. "Thank you," I said. She reached across the table and took my hand. "Mom, what happens now?" "Now," I said, "we build something." She squeezed my hand once, let go, and went back to her homework like nothing at all had changed, which was, in its own way, exactly right. I didn't quit the clinic immediately. I gave 3 months' notice because it felt like the right thing to do, and I spent that time training my replacement with more patience than I'd ever managed before, because for the first time in years, I could actually afford patience. In February, I bought a house in the North End for bedrooms, an old maple tree in the front yard, a kitchen window that looked out over a garden I had no idea yet how to keep alive. Mia stood in the driveway the first time we saw it and said, "It looks like a house where nothing ever breaks." That was exactly right. The weight I'd been quietly carrying for 3 years finally lifted, and Mia felt the change the way kids always feel the atmospheric pressure of a parent's anxiety, even when they can't name it. She joined the school's mock trial team that spring, filled the new house with friends on weekends, and started talking about Boise State, and then, with growing seriousness, about schools further away, with a kind of focused ambition I hadn't seen in her before. I set aside $4 million in a separate trust just for her future. The rest I moved carefully, a scholarship fund for first-generation students through the local community college, a 5-year commitment to Renee's programs at the YWCA, a conservative investment portfolio managed by a woman named Carol Nguyen who gave advice without ever trying to sell me anything extra. I also drove back to the Fred Meyer on Fairview and asked if Jasmine still worked there. She did, same badge, slightly different hair. I handed her a cashier's check in the break room, $8,000, and watched her stare at it for a long moment before her eyes filled. "This is real?" she asked. "It's real," I told her. She cried. I came closer to it than I expected to. As for Derek and Ashley, I heard things secondhand. The way you inevitably do in a city you've lived in long enough, Derek lost his sales job by early spring. Something about missed targets, or maybe just the general fallout of a bad year. He moved out of the place he'd shared with Ashley not long after. Ashley left her firm sometime that summer, quietly, without much explanation. Whatever they'd been building together, on the assumption that his ex-wife would eventually hand them a piece of something, simply came apart. Not because of anything more I did, just the ordinary, patient logic of consequences finding their way home. One afternoon in late April, Mia came back from mock trial practice and lay down in the grass beside me under the maple tree, looking up through the new leaves. "Mom, are you happy?" I looked up at the pale spring sky over the North End. "Yes," I said. "I really am." "Me too," she said. I finally told my mother the whole truth in May, over coffee on her back porch in Twin Falls, the beagle asleep against her slipper. She listened the same way Renee had, without interrupting, and when I finished she reached over and pressed my hand flat against the table, the way she used to when I was small and frightened of thunderstorms. "You did exactly what I would have hoped you'd do," she said. "You protected yourself first, and then you protected her." I hadn't realized how badly I needed to hear that until she said it. Denise found out a month later, from the newspaper of all places, a short paragraph buried near the back about a local trust funding scholarships, and she called me practically shrieking, half laughing, half hurt that I hadn't told her sooner. I explained as much as I could, and she forgave me almost instantly, the way good friends do once they understand the shape of what you were actually protecting. We still get lunch every other Friday, and she still has no idea most days just how close all of this came to falling apart in a courthouse hallway. I think about that scratch ticket sometimes, the one I almost refused, sitting in Jasmine's outstretched hand under the fluorescent lights of a grocery store on an ordinary Thursday. I think about how easily I could have said no, just give me the dollar, and walked out into the parking lot the same tired woman I'd been for 3 straight years. Sometimes the whole difference in a life comes down to a moment you don't even notice you're standing inside of. We stayed like that for a long time, in the yard of the house where nothing ever seemed to break.